Hello and welcome to another episode of Advanced RC Adventures. This is a channel where we investigate, explore, build and explain, upgrade, and advance Nitro RCs to another level. Come start a new adventure with me. A2RC here, and today we have another component episode for you. Today we're going to be sharing some information about the Nitro RS4 2-speed transmission. Now, if you remember, we did have an earlier episode talking about the 2-speed transmission, but today we've been asked by one of the great subscribers, one of you all, to dive deeper into something more specific. And that specific topic is, why might the 2-speed or the second speed not actually shift? There's a number of different RCs that have that condition plagued. For example, it seems like the HPI Savage is plagued with that, but I'm confident with that one as well as with these and others, that condition can be solved with some basic principles and understanding of what to do and how things work. So today we're going to talk about components, how some of them work, RPM of the engine in relation to the transmission, the assembly, and even reasons why components may drag or rub and rob RPM from the transmission and possibly leading towards a no shift condition. Right here we have a mock-up of an assembled 2-speed. Not everything is there. The brake assembly is not here. All the pins are not put into place, just so we can have easy accessible components and so that we can remove them. So we have our back transmission pulley that leads towards the rear differential. We have a brake hub as well as the brake disc. We have the brake block itself here. There's a lot of aftermarket awesome components that are made out of different alloys for the brake block. There's a bearing down inside that comes off there. And then we're left with this subassembly here. This in effect is the 2-speed transmission itself. The other pieces are just parts of that sub-assembly. We have the main drive shaft. We have the internal second speed clutch. We have that second speed bell housing here. We have the second speed spur gear, the first speed spur gear here, and then an outer pulley. Today what we're going to do is we're going to disassemble from the back here. And that leads us to the first little assembly tip. A lot of times it really only matters when you're putting it back together. But these second gear clutch bells have two set screws. One is in a direct vertical condition and another one is at an angled condition. What we're looking for is the vertical condition that lines up with these two holes here on the shaft. So what we're going to do is we're going to find those two holes. We're going to line up that spur gear, that bell for the second speed, with the hole down inside. And the main tool that we use is a 2mm driver. We're going to stick that 2mm driver down inside. We're going to find the set screw and we're going to loosen it up. Then we can go ahead and start popping off components. For example, the first one here is the clutch itself. There are a number of reasons why your 2-speed transmission may not be shifting into second gear. And we'll talk about some of those other conditions. But this may be the number one reason on why it's not. And it's either going to be the adjustment, set screw, spring, and ball, or the clutch arm itself here. The clutch is comprised of an aluminum housing. We have our steel clutch arm. We have a fulcrum pin, 2 grub screws, and down inside we have a spring and a ball. So let's continue to disassemble this and show some additional components. So right here in the center we have a set screw or a grub screw. That is going down here and holding on to the shaft, and there's a flat on that shaft. Let's go ahead and pop off this first gear spur. Right on here we have the flat on the shaft for the second gear. I'm going to go ahead and set that shaft to the side. Let's pick up the first gear. Just a simple basic spur gear, has a one-way bearing in the center, and this particular style is called the heavy duty version, and it uses what's called a gear adapter. This is the second version of the 2-speed, or at least the portion of the first gear. The first gen didn't have this purple gear adapter. It just used a one-way bearing and a little bit different style spur gear with a one-way pressed inside. Something for the third gen RS4 3 shaft-driven cars. This is actually the exact same gear adapter that is used for the RS4 3 as well, but it may just come in an orange color. But it's just something for you all to know, and something that might be interesting for some folks that just are not aware. The main topic of our conversation is revolving around the second gear itself. So let's go ahead and go to the angled hole, and we're going to pop out the set screw, the spring, and the ball. So right here we have our other set screw. It's pushing down on a spring and a ball assembly that then pushes on that clutch arm down below. So you don't want these things rolling away. Pour them out in your hand. And this is typically what you're going to see. You're going to see a silver spring, and you're going to see a chrome ball bearing. The ball bearing is very important. If you're missing it, then the total length of this sprung assembly will not be correct, and you'll have a friction point for the arm rubbing on the spring and not on the ball to make it a smooth movement. I've seen transmissions missing the ball, missing the spring, missing everything, and people wonder why their second gear is not shifting. So this is very important. As I said in the previous episode, the silver spring is a light duty spring, usually for engines that are under 1 horsepower, and then there's a black spring as well. That's generally for engines that are 1 horsepower and above. Check out the condition of your ball. Make sure that there's no debris. Sometimes these balls, if they're left for a long time in bad conditions, can have rust on them. Yes, even though they're chromed, they can eat through the chrome and develop rust. And you need to make sure that the assembly looks just like this, that there's no grease. You want it to be dry and clean. There's times where I've seen grease down inside, and eventually grease is going to attract debris, and it's going to gum that whole system up. So let's set these two components to the side. Let's not lose them, and go back to the clutch itself. You can see here we have our clutch arm that's supposed to be free floating. Now this is a brand new clutch and arm, so it's perfectly clean and free of debris, free of oil, free of anything that can hold it in place. But the main thing is that when there's nothing inside, you want to make sure that this arm is free floating. You may need to soak it in alcohol, get some brake cleaner or something. You want to clean all of the debris or grease or anything that you find off of here. There's been times where this arm, even with everything out of it, has been stuck down inside, and you need to loosen this up. One way you can do that is get a flathead screwdriver, a pick, or a pin or something, and you want to get down here and you want to pry it up. You might even need to apply a little bit of heat to it, because what's happening is if that arm is not free, then it cannot open, which is what you want it to do to catch on the bell housing of the second gear and shift your transmission. So open this up in whatever way you need to. Soak it or spray it and brake clean. Take a wire brush, clean up that surface front and back. Do whatever you got to do to make this perfectly clean and dry. You might think that putting some type of lube on here is a good thing. I suggest keeping it dry. If you want to use anything, you can use a dry film lube, or maybe even a very thin film of bearing oil, but generally speaking, you just want to keep it dry so it doesn't attract debris. So that talks about one of the reasons why you may not be shifting in to second gear. So let's put this assembly back together. You put the ball in first, down inside. You put the spring in next. Go ahead and put your grub screw back in place. Now as I screw it in, watch that arm. See how it moves back in? It's because it's pushing on that arm. And what you want to do is you want to rotate that set screw till it stops. You don't want to cram on it, just to where it stops. On the silver spring, the initial setting is 3 turns out. So that's 1, 2, and 3. That's your starting point for the second spring. But just like carb settings, it's just an initial setting. You have to put everything together, put it inside the car, and then you can test it out to find out if you're shifting or not. There are times where that set screw can be adjusted all the way out and you can be locked in second gear, or it can be adjusted all the way in and then that second gear, that arm will never come out and you'll never be able to make a shift change. But it's also an interesting feature that if you do screw it all the way in, you can do a second gear delete and you can simply run off of that first spur gear. This is something that I like to do, especially for break-ins or tuning the engine. And then once the engine is tuned, then I can start to adjust that second gear. So let's say you're not aware that you have to do 3 turns out, or you're just not sure where you're at. You truly can just screw it all the way in and then make your adjustment out. Or you can potentially screw it all the way in and just do 1 turn. Then you can drive your car, see what happens if it doesn't shift, do another turn out, drive your car, and then see if it shifts. And then you do a slow progressive march towards that second gear shift. That's just some tips on how to set up and then how to identify and trying to get your second gear to shift. So that clutch arm, it effectively rides down inside of the second gear clutch bell. And hopefully we can see this on camera, but there's a pin down inside of here. This is what's called your catch. That arm's going to open up inside and it's going to catch onto that pin. I've seen these pins fallen out before. I've seen the pins worn down completely. And unfortunately, HPI doesn't consider this to be a wearable part, and so they don't sell just the pins. You'd have to buy the entire clutch bell assembly. But I have made repairs on this pin where you can take it out, clean up the hole, and press it back in, and maybe even use some stud lock to make sure that it stays in place, and that's been an effective repair. So let's pick up the clutch again. Let's take out that set screw ball and spring so I can demonstrate how this works. This is considered a centrifugal clutch. So what that means is as this spins, the arm will open up from centrifugal forces, and the spring down inside resists that opening up until it gets past a certain RPM, and then it overcomes the pressure from the spring and it opens up. So as this spins, the arm will open up and then catch on that pin down inside. Then it engages that second gear spur. The first gear is overrun and it starts to spin on that one-way bearing there because the gear ratio has changed. Once the RPM drops, the spring pressure will push on that arm and it will close it, and then that second gear will be free spinning again. When you push on the acceleration again, the one-way bearing on the first gear will engage until it's overrun when that second gear is engaged. If the engine doesn't have enough RPM, if it's not tuned well, if it's worn out, even if your spring is adjusted, even if everything is properly assembled, if you don't have enough RPM on your engine, then that arm will not pop out, it will not engage the spur gear, and you will not be able to shift into that second gear. I want to now address some of the assembly errors that I've seen over the years. And notice here, there's a smooth face, we'll call it, and a face that has a little nub. That nub needs to face what I'll call to the outside, towards the brake block. If you have the clutch rotated and put into the wrong direction, then that's one reason why your second gear will not engage. Another reason being is as you put on your parts to your assembly, Again, we're just using this as a mock-up. There is a small washer that normally comes with your kit. And what I've noticed over the years is that this washer can be important, or it actually can be a detriment towards the second gear shifting. It's supposed to be placed down inside of here. It rides over top of the shaft, and this spacer does have a specific thickness, but because it's a man-made manufactured component, the thickness of it can vary. So you might need to get a stone and rub it smooth to where it removes some of your material. You can use some wet dry sandpaper as well, measure it, try it again. But what happens is that when your assembly goes together, it effectively puts a space in between the first and second gear. And you need a space so everything can rotate smoothly. But what I've noticed over the years is that depending on what washer or the whole stack up for the entire assembly, when you put on this outer drive pulley here, and you put on your E-clip or your C-clip here, it sandwiches it so tight that the first gear has a lot of resistance. You want that first gear to be able to spin very smoothly. And if it rubs and it's difficult to spin, then you're putting a lot of drag on the drivetrain, the transmission, and the engine. That might be one reason why you might not be able to get up into higher RPM for your second gear, not able to shift because of drag. So a lot of times what I've noticed is that you actually need to remove that washer altogether or make adjustments to this washer. It's something just to consider when you're putting everything together. There's always, or should be, a little bit of rocking, moving to your first and second gear. You don't want anything truly epic or excessive, because then when it meshes with the clutch bell, the pinion gears, then you might have a mesh issue and damage gears. But you don't want it so tight that there's no movement at all. That movement allows for that free play. So again, that's something to consider. When you're working with your brake assembly, I've noticed sometimes too, depending on how you have this adjusted, you can have brake drag under acceleration. Having brake drag on deceleration is not really that big a deal, and a lot of times the cars that I set up, I want some amount of brake drag so it slows down without hitting the brakes. But if you have brake drag during acceleration, that again can be one of the reasons why your engine can't get up to RPM and not able to shift in to the second gear. And then there's other driveline components that you might find, whether it's a worn belt, a damaged differential, bad bearings, whatever it might be, can apply drag to your drivetrain, the engine up to RPM so that you can shift into the gears. So I hope some of these explanations and this component overview gives you some insight on what to look for when your second gear is not shifting. And I hope that it truly does help you, somebody out there that might be having difficulty with their second gear, and it can get you out onto the races and having fun with your 2-speed transmission for the Nitro RS4s. If you like these types of component overviews, feel free to check out some of the other ones we've done in the past. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you like 10 scale, Nitro, and especially touring cars, then this is a place to be, and thanks for taking the adventure with me.